Welcome to this week's episode of Coffee Break Communi-cast, the only podcast exploring how people communicate. As always, this is your host, Sasha, and today I have the pleasure of being joined in the studio by renowned communication expert, Robert Harmon. Robert, welcome to the pod.
Thank you for having me, Samira. Longtime fan. I'm excited to be here.
And I'm excited to have you because, well, let's get into it. I've been following your work for a while now, really fascinating stuff. And you recently published some research that personally interests me. For the listeners at home, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Definitely. My book is called Content on the Go, How Podcasts Have Changed How We Communicate. So basically what I wanted to see was, I'm a huge podcast fan. I started listening about a decade ago, 2009.
Same for me, right around there.
Yeah, so you remember what it was like. There weren't very many programs to choose from, and what ones there were sounded like they were recorded by some random guy out of his garage.
Which probably it was.
Right.
So what has changed since those days?
Well, first, a lot more people are listening. Back in 2008, only 8% of people had ever listened to a podcast. A decade later, that number is up to 44%, with 26% of people describing themselves as regular listeners.
Which could be a lot or a little, depending on how you look at it.
Exactly. It's still a ways from reaching total saturation the way, say, television has, but the listenership has grown by leaps and bounds since those early years, and that trend doesn't show any signs of slowing.
So podcast hosts are reaching a lot of people, you
Yes.
say?
Yeah, definitely. And not only that, but the people who do listen are really passionate about it. In my research, every person I had an opportunity to speak with listened to more than one podcast. The average listener listens to 7 episodes per week. They're listening on their morning commute, they're listening while doing their chores at home, exercising, while walking the dog. These people are so loyal, so enthusiastic about the medium, that I think it really speaks about the bond, the connection that is being made between the host and the listeners.
That's fantastic. I certainly feel that with my listeners.
Right.
Now, you said in your book that you had some interesting findings.
I did. One aspect I researched was the most popular podcast right now in terms of number of downloads. You've probably heard of them. Serial,
Yeah.
The Daily, Fresh Air. What I thought was interesting was who was publishing this stuff. NPR publishes Serial and Fresh Air. The Daily is put out by the New York Times. ESPN is another top publisher. What do you notice about all these?
They're big names.
Yeah, these are all major entities. And importantly, they're all traditional media companies. Big business has gotten into podcasting in a big way. And that threw me a little because, in my mind at least, podcasting is still this small thing, you know?
Right.
Pirate radio, anyone with a microphone and an internet connection could have a platform. It gave the small man a voice in the conversation. But that's changed. My concern is that the larger voices, the NPRs, the ESPNs, all the voices who have always been there, will crowd out these smaller voices.
So the fear is that we'll be right back where we started, with a handful of corporates dominating the airwaves.
At first, yes, that seemed to be the case. But when I actually went out and asked people to name the podcast they listened to the most, I got quite a variety of responses. About half were hugely popular podcasts like Serial, but the other half were smaller niche ones.
Such as?
Well, there were so many. For example, Binge Mode. It's a podcast where the hosts analyze all the Harry Potter books chapter by chapter. Or Jesus and Jollof is this
I love that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jesus and Jollof is another one where 2 Nigerian women tell fun little stories about their daily lives.
Yeah. So how do you reconcile with these ideas that there are these dominant publishers, but also these small niches that you mentioned?
Well, the best analogy I can use to explain it is coffee shops. If you were to look at the highest grossing coffee shops in the US, you would have Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts at the top of the list. But there are also thousands of small, single location coffee shops all over the country. The coffee industry is big enough to accommodate both the big and small businesses, just as the podcast industry has enough room for both the big and small content producers.
So bottom line, how has podcasting changed the way we communicate?
Well, for some, podcasting hasn't changed the information we receive. They listen to the programs from traditional media outlets with traditional ideas, but they may have changed when and where they get that information. For example, someone might listen to the New York Times podcast in the car instead of reading the newspaper. For others, podcasting is a means of discovering a small group of people with a specific interest that they couldn't find in a conventional medium. For instance, the podcast discussing the Harry Potter books is one chapter at a time, is content that someone couldn't find on a major network. Most likely, it's a combination. People have changed how they communicate by listening to content on the go, and what is being communicated, their new perspectives from new voices. Overall, I feel pretty optimistic about the future of the industry. As the podcasting world continues to evolve and rise in popularity, its effects on communication will certainly expand as well.
Well, Robert, thanks for stopping by. The new book is out now, available through Amazon or wherever books are sold. For Coffee Break Communi-cast, this is Sasha saying good night and have a pleasant tomorrow.